Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Sundog by Stephen King. Now, this is a novella that was first published in King's 1990 collection, Four Past Midnight. However, later on it was put out as a self-contained novel. Now, I read the standalone edition of The Sundog, however, I do actually have a copy of Four Past Midnight right here. Now, this collection also features the stories The Library Policeman, The Langoliers, which was made into the infamous made-for-TV miniseries from Tom Holland. And no, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland. I don't even think he was alive when that miniseries came out. I mean the Tom Holland who also directed Fright Night and Child's Play. This collection also features the story Secret Window, Secret Garden, which was later made into the movie Secret Window with Johnny Depp. Now, the plot of The Sundog is it's set in the fictional town of Castle Rock, Maine, which is a town that features in many of Stephen King's other stories. But we follow a 15-year-old boy named Kevin Delevan who recently got a Polaroid camera for his birthday, which he was really excited about until he took a picture of his family with the camera, and what came out was not a picture of his family, but was a picture of this strange-looking dog in front of a dirty white picket fence. And every time he snaps a photo, no matter where he's pointing the camera, it's the same unsettling picture of this dog in front of the picket fence. Eventually, Kevin takes the camera to this sort of sleazy shop owner named Pop Merrill, at first to see if he could get the camera fixed. But Pop, much like Kevin, becomes absolutely obsessed with this camera. But whereas Kevin starts to realize that there's something not right about this camera, and there's something terribly wrong with these pictures, Pop decides that he's going to try to profit off this camera. But with each picture they take, they start to notice that the dog is getting closer and closer to them. Now, The Sundog was a solid read. It's definitely not going to go down as one of my favorite Stephen King stories, but it was an effective little horror story. I will say, however, this probably would have benefited from being a little bit shorter, if I'm being honest. Like, this probably could have worked better as a 30 or 40 page long short story as opposed to a full-length novella. And I know that's sort of a common criticism of Stephen King, is that he tends to sort of overwrite or go into what are seen as unnecessary details, and I've never really had that problem with Stephen King because, while most people see it as a weakness, I've always seen it as one of Stephen King's greatest strengths. Like, personally, I love how Stephen King would sometimes latch on to a random side character and will all of a sudden get like 15 pages of backstory on this character who doesn't really have anything to do with the main plot. Like, people complain about that all the time. Personally, I love shit like that, because it makes the world of his books feel fuller and more real, and I love the idea of a seemingly isolated event affecting the lives of all these other characters, and in some cases, all these other stories. But even I have my limits with Stephen King's writing style. For example, when Kevin first meets Pop in this book, there's a good 5 or 6 pages of Pop just talking to Kevin about cameras, and while it's technically relevant to the story, I was kind of like, okay, let's move this along. And honestly, this particular story, with the premise that it has, I just think it would have worked better if it was shorter. Especially because this particular story really does have sort of a Twilight Zone feel to it. Twilight Zone mixed with EC Comics. In fact, the ending of this story feels like something right out of an old Tales from the Crypt or Haunt of Fear comic. In fact, if this story were shorter, this would have been a great basis for like a Tales from the Dark Side episode or something. But this is not a bad book. It's not a bad book at all. Like I said, it is a very effective and very creepy little horror story, and King is really good at taking these very simple premises, like the premise of a haunted camera, and just running with it. And the story does get genuinely unsettling at times, and I also appreciate how Stephen King never really explains what's causing the camera to do this. You could certainly have your own theories, especially if you tie this in with some of Stephen King's other stories, but just looking at this as a standalone story, we really get no real explanation for how the camera is able to do this and why the camera is doing this. And sometimes ambiguity can go a long way in horror. Sometimes less is more when it comes to the horror genre. And I liked how in the story the supernatural elements are relatively subtle until we get to the ending, where it gets really over the top and really freaking surreal in a good way. Like I said, the ending feels right out of EC Comics. Now, probably Stephen King's main strength as a writer is his characters. Stephen King usually writes very likable and very believable characters. Even if his characters can be somewhat archetypical, I think Stephen King does a decent job at making even a character who's an archetype not necessarily feel like a stereotype. And Kevin is a likable protagonist. Stephen King writes youth really well, and he's also really good at writing father-son relationships, and in this story you see Kevin start to develop a stronger bond with his father and start to understand his father a little bit more, especially when he learns some things about his father. Like, it turns out that Kevin's father has had some dealings with Pop Merrill in the past. And in the story, Kevin's father is one of those purely rational people. He doesn't even remotely entertain the idea of ghosts, and he doesn't even like horror movies because to him those don't reflect reality. But when confronted with this camera, even he's like, holy fuck, there's something supernatural going on here, and we gotta destroy this camera because this thing is fucking evil. And that's a theme you see run throughout a lot of Stephen King's work, is the rational character whose beliefs get challenged by what's in front of them. Now, while Kevin and his father are likable characters, for me the best character in this book is easily Pop Merrill, and you could tell Stephen King had a lot of fun writing this character. And what makes Pop Merrill an effective antagonist is he starts off very likable and very charming, and you could see how a naive teenage boy like Kevin would sort of fall under Pop's spell. But more and more you start to realize that, yeah, this guy is kind of a sleazebag and is definitely a scam artist. But what differentiates Pop from other Stephen King villains is he's not out and out evil. He's just greedy, and his greed and his arrogance in thinking that he can control something that is totally beyond his understanding is ultimately his downfall by the end of the story. But yeah, The Sundog, it's definitely not one of Stephen King's best, and it is a bit longer than it needed to be, but it is a solid read, and again, it is a very creepy story, so if you're a Stephen King fan, I would recommend it. Now, a lot of Stephen King's books take place in the same universe, and a lot of them interlock with each other. For example, like I said before, this is set in the town of Castle Rock, which first appeared in King's 1979 novel, The Dead Zone. Also, the character of George Bannerman, who is the sheriff of Castle Rock in that novel, is briefly referenced in this book. George Bannerman also played a major role in Cujo, and actually the events of Cujo are also referenced in this book as well. Now, this is pure fan speculation on my part, but I feel like it's almost insinuated, especially in a certain dream sequence in this book, that somehow this camera is being possessed by the spirit of Cujo. What does poke holes in that theory is the fact that the dog that appears in these photos does not appear to be the same breed as Cujo. At the same time, the book is actually very ambiguous with what breed of dog this actually is. All we know is that it's black, and as far as I know, there aren't any black St. Bernards out there. At least not that I'm aware of. But a way you could look at it is perhaps the dog in these photos is more of a representation of what Cujo has come to represent to to the people of Castle Rock, like perhaps the memory of what Cujo did has sort of manifested itself as a kind of a demon. But once again, that is pure fan speculation on my part. Another connection this has with another one of Stephen King's stories, and this is a big one, is Pop Merrill from this book is actually the uncle of Ace Merrill, who is the main antagonist of The Body, which was later adapted into the movie Stand By Me. Ace Merrill is the character that Kiefer Sutherland played in the movie Stand By Me. Ace would also go on to be the secondary antagonist of Needful Things, and also the character of Alan Pangborn, who at this point in the timeline is the current sheriff of Castle Rock, who is the protagonist of Needful Things. He's also referenced quite a bit in this book. Alan Pangborn first showed up in King's 1989 novel The Dark Half, and actually Stephen King has said that he kind of wanted the Sundog to be sort of a bridge between The Dark Half and Needful Things. Like, he considers The Dark Half, The Sundog, and Needful Things to almost be like sort of a trilogy, if you will. And actually, it is interesting to read The Sundog as almost like a prologue to Needful Things, because Needful Things is about this man who comes to Castle Rock, who is later revealed to be a demon, possibly even Satan himself in human form. And even if he's not the devil himself, he could be seen as an agent of the devil, or possibly even an agent of the Crimson King from the Dark Tower books, who of course could be Satan. But it's interesting to think that maybe Leland Gaunt, the antagonist of Needful Things, was somehow responsible for this camera, and if he is the devil, perhaps this Sundog is actually a hellhound, almost foreshadowing his arrival to the town. But again, that is purely a fan theory. Now, like I said, the book never really explains what's causing the camera to do all this, but it's definitely insinuated that this camera is sort of opening the gateway to another world, and if you interpret the Sundog as a kind of a demon, perhaps the camera is opening the gateway to hell, or perhaps it's simply opening the gateway to some other universe that we barely understand, and that is a possible connection you could make with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which is all about alternate universes and parallel timelines and other dimensions. Also, when Pop is talking about his nephew, he says that Ace is currently serving time at Shawshank State Prison, which was the setting of Stephen King's novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. There's also a brief reference to the Jupiter Hill Psychiatric Hospital, which is the hospital that Henry Bowers went to in It. There's also an interesting reference in here, not to one of Stephen King's stories, but to H.P. Lovecraft stories. There's a part of this book where Pop is trying to sell the camera to people he knows who have dealt with the supernatural before, or at least believe in the supernatural, and it mentions Pop having heard this story about this guy from a town called Dunwich, Massachusetts, who went insane, and it also references the town of Arkham, which are both towns from H.P. Lovecraft stories. Now, obviously that reference was just meant as a little in-joke because Stephen King was a huge Lovecraft fan, but a way you could look at it is perhaps the towns of Dunwich and Arkham do exist in the Stephen King universe, or another way you could look at it is perhaps this is just a story that Pop heard and Pop wasn't smart enough to realize that those two towns are just fictional towns from H.P. Lovecraft stories. But Stephen King has borrowed from H.P. Lovecraft before. For example, the Necronomicon has appeared in several of his stories like I Know What You Need, Grandma, and even The Eyes of the Dragon. And even in the Dark Tower books, there are references to these dimensional spaces between the worlds filled with monsters and demons, and it is sort of insinuated that these beings from these dimensional spaces are actually the Elder Gods, or the Old Ones from H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Now, while there was never a direct adaptation of The Sundog, there was the Hulu series Castle Rock created by J.J. Abrams, which, while not being written by Stephen King, is based on the fictional universe of Stephen King's books. Now, with the show Castle Rock, which unfortunately ran for only 2 seasons, it was set in the universe of Stephen King's books, but almost more of an alternate timeline. If you want to tie it in with the Dark Tower books, you could say it was set on sort of another level of the tower. Like, Alan Pangborn showed up in Season 1, and Annie Wilkes from Misery showed up in Season 2, as well as Ace Morrill from The Body and Needful Things showed up in Season 2, as well as Pop Merrill from this book, who was played by Tim Robbins in the show. But the character who showed up on Season 2 of Castle Rock was clearly sort of an alternate universe version of the Pop Merrill from the Sundog. Like, it wasn't exactly the same character that we saw in this book, but Tim Robbins was excellent as Pop Merrill on that show. Now, in recent years, analog horror has become a really big thing on the internet. Analog horror is sort of a subgenre of found footage that's almost exclusive to the internet, where they utilize old technology like VHS cameras, or sometimes they'll even show like PSAs or commercials to establish the universe that they're trying to create. And the reason I'm bringing analog horror up is I feel like the premise of The Sundog would be a great setup for an analog horror series. But yeah, that was my review on The Sundog by Stephen King, and long days and pleasant nights to you.